Buenos días a todas y todos. Les damos la bienvenida al workshop Neuroderechos en Chile, el debate filosófico, organizado por la Comisión Desafíos del Futuro del Senado de Chile, el profesor Rafael Yuste de la Universidad de Columbia y el Grupo de Neuroética de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, y auspiciado por el Columbia Global Centers Santiago. El workshop está organizado en 7 sesiones en inglés y con subtítulos en español, una sesión de apertura y una de cierre, más 5 sesiones dedicadas a cada uno de los 5 neuroderechos, presentados por los proyectos de ley chilenos para la regulación de la neurotecnología y propuestos originalmente por el Morningside Group. Esto es, el derecho a la identidad personal, al libre albedrío, a la privacidad mental, al acceso equitativo para las tecnologías para el aumento de la capacidad cognitiva y a la protección contra los sesgos de los algoritmos. El día de hoy tendremos 3 sesiones. La sesión de apertura, donde se discutirá el futuro de los neuroderechos, la sesión A sobre autonomía y agencia, y la sesión B sobre identidad personal, continuidad psicológica e integridad mental. A continuación, escucharemos las palabras de bienvenida de las autoridades de las instituciones organizadoras del evento y protagonistas de la llegada de los neuroderechos a Chile: el rector Eduardo Silva Arévalo, el senador Guido Girardi y el profesor Rafael Yuste. Eduardo Silva Arévalo es jesuita y rector de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado desde 2016. Trabaja en la universidad desde su fundación y fue decano de la Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades. Guido Girardi es médico cirujano y político por el Partido por la Democracia de Chile, es senador por la 7ª circunscripción, región metropolitana, y fue presidente y vicepresidente del Senado. Rafael Yuste es profesor de Ciencias Biológicas de la Universidad de Columbia y director del Centro de Neurotecnología de la misma universidad. Lideró el grupo de científicos que inspiró la iniciativa BRAIN de los Estados Unidos, una iniciativa de investigación colaborativa con el objetivo de apoyar el desarrollo y la aplicación de neurotecnologías innovadoras. Los dejo, ahora sí, con nuestros anfitriones. Buen día, rector. Tiene la palabra.
Muy buenos días. En nombre de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y de su Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades, les doy la bienvenida a este workshop que reúne a un grupo muy destacado de especialistas. Como ha dicho el profesor Rafael Yuste, Chile puede ser un pionero en la neuroregulación y en incluir este desafío dentro del marco de los derechos humanos. Ello gracias a los 2 proyectos de ley vinculados al establecimiento y la protección de los neuroderechos, el proyecto de reforma constitucional y el proyecto de ley sobre neuroprotección. Ambos proyectos fueron elaborados durante el año pasado por la Comisión del Senado chileno, encabezada por el senador Guido Girardi, con el apoyo de varias instituciones. Los desarrollos científicos y tecnológicos actuales permiten intervenir en la actividad neuronal de las personas, registrándola, modificándola y transfiriéndola, al menos parcialmente, como información digital. Tal intervención podría poner en riesgo la identidad, privacidad y libertad de las personas. Esto configura un nuevo escenario, no solo para pensar al ser humano, sino para proteger sus derechos frente a potenciales riesgos y amenazas. Son problemas que no van a solucionar las propias transformaciones de las neurotecnologías. Son cuestiones que la tradición filosófica y humanista ha discutido desde antaño. Autonomía, identidad, libre albedrío, analizados y discutidos por generaciones de filósofos y filósofas durante siglos. El desafío, repensar lo humano en tiempos de transhumanismo y poshumanismo. Desafíos que ocupan a la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, heredera de una larga tradición jesuita y a la vez atenta a lo contemporáneo, a los signos de nuestro tiempo. Permítanme 2 breves consideraciones, una sobre el poder y la otra sobre la debilidad. La ciencia y tecnología, que es de lo que nos ocupamos las universidades, son bienes, pero como todo, para que no sean un poder que amenaza tanto al planeta como a nuestros cerebros, deben ser regulados. La voluntad de poder, la racionalidad instrumental que no conoce límites, necesita del derecho, de la norma de la regla. Solo los niños y los narcisos creen que la libertad es simplemente hacer lo que queremos. Solo los tiranos omnipotentes y los violentos estiman que para ser libres hay que hacer todo lo que pueden. La libertad humana es el ámbito de lo que debemos. La máxima expresión de la libertad es el derecho, nos enseña Hegel. El derecho, la regulación, es la que permite defender nuestro cerebro de la manipulación y de la apropiación indebida. Necesita defensa porque la mente humana, ante los avances de la ciencia, es vulnerable. La norma, la ética, la justicia existe para defender lo débil. El cuidado de los más débiles es también la tarea de la política. Además de las personas, incluido nuestro cuerpo y nuestro cerebro, lo débil, en palabras del filósofo Paul Ricoeur, incluye otros ámbitos, otros dos débiles más importantísimos: la democracia y el planeta. El cuidado de la casa común, el cuidado de nuestra frágil convivencia nacional, el cuidado de nuestras instituciones, el cuidado de la nueva constitución que nos convoca. El poder y su amenaza frente a lo vulnerable que tenemos que proteger con la regla, con el derecho. Con este horizonte amplio ha llegado el momento de conversar sobre los neuroderechos y es necesario que, siendo una temática tan fundamental, el foro está abierto a todas las perspectivas que constituyen la experiencia humana. Es natural que invitemos a los expertos en derecho, a las humanidades, a los científicos, a los filósofos, a la ciudadanía en general, a dialogar sobre la forma de vida que queremos construir junto a una tecnología que se deja regular y a una ley que protege lo vulnerable, lo débil, como nuestro cerebro. Muchas gracias, bienvenidos a Pensar.
Muchas gracias, rector. Bueno, buen día, senador. Tiene la palabra.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo quiero agradecer a la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, porque me parece muy importante que sea líder y pionera en desarrollar este tipo de debate y evidentemente también a todo el trabajo que hemos hecho con Rafael. ¿Por qué es importante esto? Porque yo creo que estamos enfrentando el mayor desafío que ha tenido la humanidad. Porque por primera vez el ser humano puede cambiar la historia del humano. No solamente intervenir la naturaleza, como lo hizo en los siglos pasados, sino intervenir las bases de la vida. Y yo creo que estamos en un punto de inflexión. Lo primero que yo quiero señalar es que a mí me parece que si nuestra humanidad quiere sobrevivir es fundamental la tecnología. Sin tecnología, y ha sido parte de la historia de la evolución, la humanidad no va a sobrevivir, pero estamos viviendo un proceso de transformación tecnológica inédito en la historia de nuestra evolución. Nunca antes la tecnología había evolucionado a la velocidad que está evolucionando. Por lo tanto, estamos construyendo un mundo que no tiene capacidad de hacer previsión. No estamos trabajando en definir futuros posibles. Solo decir, por ejemplo, que la inteligencia artificial progresa hoy 100 veces de un año a otro, pero en 10 años más va a progresar probablemente millones de veces de un año a otro. Y en el 2045 ya hay algunos científicos como Ray Kurzweil que dice que la inteligencia artificial va a ser 1000 millones de veces más potente que la inteligencia de todos los seres humanos juntos. Al mismo tiempo aumenta la cantidad de datos. Los datos están progresando, duplicándose de un año a otro, pero ahora con Internet de las cosas va a haber un tsunami de datos. Y lo mismo la capacidad de memoria, que se duplica cada 18 meses hoy día, la ley de Moore, pero a futuro, con la revolución cuántica, la computación cuántica, puede ser que la capacidad de memoria se duplique cada segundo. Y por lo tanto la brecha con el humano van a ser gigantesca. ¿Y por qué tiene importancia esto? Porque nosotros tenemos todo un chasis institucional que está hecho para la segunda revolución industrial, donde la mano de obra era el factor de productividad, donde el combustible era el petróleo, pero una vez que lo usaba disminuía el petróleo, y donde los motores eran los motores de combustión que eran estáticos, no han cambiado mucho los motores de combustión en 100 años. Lo que estamos enfrentando es una revolución donde los motores son evolutivos porque son algoritmos que son cada vez más potentes y están asociados a la inteligencia artificial, donde el combustible también es evolutivo, son los datos, y por lo tanto está transformando todo lo que conocemos y generando el producto tecnológico más potente el uso de estos motores con este combustible que son los datos, que es la inteligencia artificial. El que domine la inteligencia artificial va a dominar la geopolítica del futuro, es decir, el poder militar, el poder económico, el poder democrático, va a tener un poder incontrarrestable y por lo tanto generar una democracia sobre estos procesos es fundamental. Yo quiero señalar que el mayor desafío, el mayor conflicto, la guerra del siglo XXI es la guerra de los cerebros. Es la guerra por capturar nuestros datos y por intervenir en nuestros cerebros. Esa es la geopolítica del siglo XXI. Y si ese es el territorio de batalla, entonces nosotros no podemos llegar tarde. Tenemos que proteger justamente a los cerebros de que si ese va a ser la disputa geopolítica y la disputa del poder del siglo XXI, entonces ¿cómo se protege eso? Ya lo estamos viendo y por eso que es muy importante las neurotecnologías. Hoy día son la última frontera porque permiten directamente intervenir el cerebro sin ninguna mediación. Permiten leer sus emociones, leer incluso el inconsciente, leer los pensamientos y también pueden introducir dentro de los cerebros pensamientos, emociones, odios que las personas no construyeron, que son productos de diseño. Y por lo tanto, la indemnidad del cerebro, o aquí se está jugando el libre albedrío del ser humano, los principios más fundamentales de libertad, pero también esta neurotecnología, igual que la energía nuclear, puede tener usos benéficos, que son los que necesitamos usar para, por ejemplo, enfrentar los problemas neurodegenerativos, problemas de salud mental. Por lo tanto, aquí no se trata de que, en cierta manera, cuestionar las tecnologías per se, sino usar o que tengan un sentido ético. Por eso que la ciencia, sin filosofía, sin ética, hoy día es tremendamente peligroso, así como fue usar la energía nuclear para Hiroshima y Nagasaki. Pero también tenemos un contexto mayor, porque hoy día, a partir de la extracción de datos, hoy día todas las plataformas están centradas en capturar nuestras conciencias para extraernos los datos sin nuestro consentimiento. Lo hace Facebook, lo hace Google. Por lo tanto, no es solo estas neurotecnologías que son directamente pueden intervenir dentro del cerebro, sino que ya estamos siendo neuroprogramados. Ya estamos en un cuestionamiento de la democracia y del humanismo liberal, porque el humanismo liberal supone que el ser humano es quien mejor puede tomar decisiones en materia que elegir desde el punto de vista político, qué arte ver, qué consumir, qué pareja elegir. Pero cuando ya hay países donde Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, una parte importante, los americanos eligen sus parejas por Tinder, ya el amor, que era lo más propio humano, se transforma en una optimización matemática. Entonces, yo creo que aquí está en cuestión el futuro del humano. Como decía Eduardo, estamos en una transición porque hay actores ideológicos que quieren transitar a un poshumano o a partir de capacidades cerebrales aumentadas, de prolongar la vida, pero eso ya no es Homo sapiens. Y yo creo que somos los seres humanos que tenemos que decidir si queremos seguir siendo Homo sapiens o queremos ser parte de esta aventura evolutiva de construir un poshumano. A mí me parece que es la esencia misma de la democracia, pero también de la intervención, porque Cambridge Analytics, todos estos procesos han cambiado o han transformado o han modificado decisiones y por lo tanto hoy día lo que está en riesgo es la democracia, está en riesgo el humano tal y como lo conocemos, está en riesgo una sociedad más igualitaria porque estas neurotecnologías pueden ser usadas para la igualdad, pero también para construir un mundo mucho más desigual del que nunca nos hubiésemos imaginado, si algunos tienen todo el poder. Solo decir que en los próximos 20 años la mitad de los empleos van a desaparecer. Y la renta del capital que hoy día se distribuye pagando mano de obra, finalmente en 20 años más, solo una ínfima parte de la renta capital va a ir a pagar mano de obra y va a aumentar evidentemente la desigualdad en el mundo y la precarización. ¿Cómo enfrentamos eso? ¿Cómo damos respuesta? Por lo tanto, a mí me parece que lo que tenemos que avanzar en un ecosistema. Yo lo último que quiero señalar, Eduardo, nosotros acabamos de constituir una comisión, la Comisión del Futuro, justamente para regular el ciberespacio. El ciberespacio es el territorio del futuro. Es donde va a transcurrir nuestra vida. Ahora estamos en el ciberespacio, cuando estamos en Zoom, o cuando estudiamos por Internet, o cuando trabajamos por Internet, o cuando estamos espacios de ocio en los Netflix, estamos en el ciberespacio. Ese territorio donde va a transcurrir la vida del ser humano en el siglo XXI y a futuro, cada vez más, es un territorio totalmente desregulado, que no tiene chasis democrático, que no tiene resoluciones, y es la ley del más fuerte, es un Far West. Y ese es el territorio que quiere mantener Google, que quiere mantener Facebook, las plataformas americanas y chinas, porque su gran objetivo es apropiarse de los datos. ¿Por qué? No solo por la publicidad hoy día. Hoy día ya el giro de Facebook y de Google, no solo la publicidad que los ha hecho multimillonarios, sino es la capacidad de generar inteligencia artificial. Y ellos saben muy bien, los chinos y ellos, que los que generen la inteligencia artificial y se apropien de ella van a ser dueños del mundo. Puede llegar a una situación utópica que yo evidentemente no deseo, que se disrupten incluso los estados nacionales, así como Kodak, pueden desaparecer universidades, pero pueden desaparecer estados nacionales completos. Y finalmente tener una gobernanza de plataformas que van a apropiarse de los seres humanos. Ese mundo no es el que queremos. Queremos que esta tecnología, esta neurotecnología, las directas que leen el cerebro, pero también estas indirectas que procesan datos y nos anticipan a través de algoritmos, tengan regulaciones. Por lo tanto, la democratización de esto, del Internet, el transformar los datos en bienes públicos que nadie se pueda apropiar, en establecer protocolos de regulación de la inteligencia artificial, como se hizo para la energía nuclear, son fundamentales y prioritarias. Por eso que esto es interesante, porque el Congreso del Futuro ha unido la ciencia chilena con la ciencia global, por eso nuestra alianza con Rafael y su equipo, para generar un espacio de intersección, porque estos temas no están a escala nacional, el ciberespacio trasciende el espacio de Chile y tenemos que hacer una alianza global, y en eso yo quiero agradecer a Rafael de haber llevado esta preocupación como una alianza global. Este no es un problema de los chilenos, es un problema de la humanidad. Y solo los chilenos lo vamos a hacer. Por esto que esto es un piloto, esto es un laboratorio, para ojalá que otros países y otras sociedades puedan tomar este desafío junto con nosotros, de entender que el gran campo de batalla del futuro es el cerebro, los seres humanos, y tenemos que protegerlo.
Muchas gracias, senador. Buen día, profesor. Tiene la palabra.
Buenos días desde Nueva York, desde el campus de la Columbia, que lo tengo aquí detrás de mi viejo microscopio. A todos los espectadores que nos están siguiendo, quería agradecer al Senado de la República, que representa al pueblo chileno, y a su Comisión del Futuro, dirigida por el senador Girardi, que es coorganizadora de este simposio, y también agradecer a la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y a su rector Eduardo Silva el liderazgo que han demostrado, y al equipo que está detrás. Y por último también agradecer al Centro de la Universidad de Columbia en Santiago, que también han contribuido a sponsorizar este simposio. Quería hacer 3 comentarios muy breves. Primero, ¿qué son los neuroderechos? Para ustedes que nos escuchen, que no hayan oído este término antes, los neuroderechos son nuevos derechos humanos que no se encuentran recogidos en la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos, y la propuesta es añadirlos a la lista de derechos humanos para que protejan el cerebro de las personas. Se puede pensar de una manera rápida que la existente Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos protege el cuerpo de las personas y las actividades de las personas, pero no protege el cerebro, no protege la mente. Estos neuroderechos, como saben ustedes, están en proceso de ser incorporados a la Constitución chilena y a las leyes de la República a través del proyecto de reforma de Constitución y el proyecto de ley que se están discutiendo y aprobando por ahora por mayoría unánime en el Senado de la República. Y como han oído ustedes, esta legislación y estos proyectos son pioneros en el mundo. En este caso, Chile está destacando como el país donde se está haciendo esto por primera vez, ¿no? Quería también discutir muy brevemente por qué son importantes los neuroderechos, por qué hay que hacer todo esto, a la gente sobre todo que no se escucha y que no ha oído de este tema antes. Pues son importantes por 2 razones. La primera razón que es importante, que la han oído ustedes ya mencionar, es para proteger a la ciudadanía. Son de neuroprotección, proteger de los abusos potenciales que ahora mismo no ocurren, pero que pueden ocurrir por la aplicación de un montón de tecnologías nuevas, neurotecnologías, que se utilizan para leer la actividad cerebral y para cambiarla, para alterarla. Y vamos a discutir estos ejemplos de neurotecnología y la necesidad de neuroderechos con detalle en las próximas sesiones. Vamos a desglosar el tema poco a poco con expertos mundiales que aporten su grano de arena a la discusión. Esta es la razón fundamental por la cual el Senado de la República se ha embarcado en estos dos proyectos de reforma y proyectos de ley, y la razón por la cual los neuroderechos han sido propuestos. Pero hay otra razón, un poco haciendo eco de las palabras del senador Girardi, y tiene que ver con el problema de la era digital. No es ninguna novedad para ustedes el que estamos viviendo, estamos entrando de golpe en un mundo digital. Y esto ha sido impulsado más que nada en el último año por la pandemia del COVID. Gran parte de nuestra vida cada vez más se desarrolla no en el mundo físico, sino en el mundo digital. Y tampoco debe ser noticia para ustedes que esta entrada apresurada de la humanidad al mundo digital ha tenido muchos problemas. Miren ustedes, por ejemplo, lo que está ocurriendo con las redes sociales y cómo están siendo elementos disruptivos socialmente y políticamente en el mundo. Hay muchos ejemplos de cómo la tecnología digital, que nos ha caído como de golpe, nos ha un poco alterado la sociedad en la que vivimos, ¿no? Y lo que han hecho países para poder arreglar estos problemas que están surgiendo con la tecnología digital es sacar leyes y poner parches. Es como si tuvieses un globo con agujeros donde se escapa el agua y lo estás intentando parar poniendo un parche aquí, una tirita, una curita aquí. Estos son, por ejemplo, las leyes que están ocurriendo, la famosa ley europea de protección de datos. Es como un parche para que los problemas de privacidad pues, no se escapen por ahí todos, ¿no? Y esto es una estrategia, diríamos, a corto plazo, pero no es una estrategia ideal, ¿no? Y ahí es donde tiene importancia los neuroderechos. Los neuroderechos, estamos hablando ya de proteger el órgano, el cerebro, que genera la mente humana. Y la mente humana es todo lo que somos, es lo que caracteriza al ser humano, está generado por el cerebro. Con lo cual, no podemos seguir poniendo parches. Tenemos que abordar el problema de otra manera. Y esta otra manera de abordar el problema de protección de la ciudadanía con respecto a las nuevas tecnologías es llevar el problema a la arena de los derechos humanos. Esto es una cosa que no se ha hecho con las tecnologías digitales y esto es una cosa que es forzosamente hay que hacerlo con las neurotecnologías. Y por eso tienen los neuroderechos otra segunda importancia. No solamente importancia de por sí de proteger a la ciudadanía de las tecnologías, de las neurotecnologías, sino los neuroderechos pueden ser una punta de lanza de derechos humanos en la era digital, donde se cubra no solamente los problemas generados por las neurotecnologías, pero los problemas generados por todas las tecnologías. Y este es un poco el objetivo último de este simposio, es llevar el debate de la regulación de las tecnologías digitales al campo, al terreno de los derechos humanos. Es como si construyéramos con los derechos humanos un recipiente blindado donde no hay que poner más parches, no se escapa ya el agua, porque está anclado en la base ética de los derechos humanos. Y acabo diciendo que la razón también por la cual estamos abordando este segundo tema, que será, por cierto, el objetivo de la última sesión de este simposio, el viernes por la mañana, una razón importante, como saben ustedes, es el proceso constituyente en el cual Chile está entrando. Va a haber una nueva constitución en la República y se tiene la posibilidad, el pueblo chileno y el Senado y la Cámara tienen la posibilidad de escribir una constitución de nuevo y poder incorporar a esta constitución valores de derechos humanos que protejan por primera vez a un país no solamente de las tecnologías, no solamente las neurotecnologías, sino, como digo, de todas las tecnologías digitales. Entonces, les animo a ustedes que sigan conectados a este congreso, a este simposio, y sobre todo que escuchen con atención las conclusiones de la última sesión del viernes por la mañana, porque, como digo, esto puede tener una importancia mayor de la que pensamos. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Bueno, muchas gracias, rector, senador y profesor, por esta muy cálida bienvenida. Hacemos ahora una muy breve pausa para pasar a la sesión de apertura, así que nos vemos en unos minutos.
Welcome to the workshop's opening session. I am Francisco Pereira, Associate Professor at Alberto Hurtado University and a member of the university's Neuroethics group. I will be the moderator of today's sessions. In this session, the opening session, we will be discussing the future steps in the establishment of neurorights. We will hear comments by Rafael Yuste, Pedro Maldonado, Abel Wajnerman and Joseph Fins. Let me introduce you, the speakers. Rafael Yuste is a professor of biological sciences at Columbia University and director of the Center for Neurotechnology at the same university. He led the group of scientists that inspired the United States BRAIN Initiative, a collaborative public-private research initiative announced by the Obama administration in 2013, with the goal of supporting the development and application of innovative technologies that can create a dynamic understanding of brain function and disorders. Pedro Maldonado is a principal investigator and director of the Department of Neuroscience at the Millennium Institute for Neuroscience Biomedicine in Chile. He's a founding member of the Chilean Society of Neuroscience and a professor of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Chile. Abel Wajnerman is an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy at Alberto Hurtado University. He is the director of the Neuroethics Research Group at the same university, and his main areas of interest are philosophy of cognitive neuroscience and neuroethics. Finally, Dr. Joseph Fins is a professor of medical ethics and chief of the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College, where he also serves as a professor of medicine, professors of public health, and professors of medicine in psychiatry. He's an elected member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences at the United States. He was elected as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012 and was elected in 2020 to serve as president-elect of the International Neuroethics Society. Now, we are going to hear Rafael Yuste. Hi, Rafael, the screen is yours, and remember to turn on your microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco, and greetings to everyone from New York, from Columbia University. So I'm going to start talking about the brain. So as you know, I hope it's not news to you, that the brain is not just another organ in the body, but it is the organ that generates all of our mental and cognitive abilities. I'm talking about all your perception, your memories, your thoughts, your behavior, your emotions, your imagination. All of that doesn't come out of thin air. It's actually generated in a way which we don't understand, by the firing of large networks of neurons that we have inside the skull. Now, neuroscience has been trying to understand how the brain works for over 100 years, and we still don't have a general theory. But arriving at a general theory, at a general understanding of brain function, is going to have fundamental importance for humanity for three reasons. One, scientifically, because it will enable us to understand for the first time the human mind. We will understand ourselves from the inside. So this will be the ultimate humanism. We will be able to see what is a human being and understand why we behave the way we behave and why we think the way we think, etc. The second reason is a medical reason, as everyone who's listening knows from personal experience with family friends or family members that suffer from mental or neurological diseases. These diseases don't have a very good therapies today, in spite of the titanic efforts of psychiatrists and neurologists. I'm talking about Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression, Parkinson, mental retardation, stroke, paralysis, etc. So brain diseases are the dark corner of medicine because we don't understand as doctors how the system works. So it's very hard to fix the system when it's broken. The third reason why neuroscience, understanding how the brain works, will be of fundamental importance for humanity has to do with technology. It's an economic reason. Nervous system, not just in humans, but in all animals, are computing very sophisticated calculations with very little energy. So they must be using an alternative way of computing than what we have implemented in digital computers. So the more we understand how the brain works, the more our technology, our computing, our technology will be revolutionized by this. So it is expected that understanding the brain will lead to a new type of technology. Talking about technology, the reason why we don't understand how the brain works is because we don't have the right tools yet. So this is where neurotechnology comes about. Neurotechnology is methods to do two things: to record the activity of neurons in the brain and to change, to alter the activity of neurons in the brain. And there's two types of technologies. There are technologies which are invasive, which means that you need neurosurgery to put in a chip. For example, these technologies could be electronic, they could be optical, magnetic, chemical, etc. And they could be non-invasive, in which instead of needing neurosurgery, you can just wear as a helmet, as a hat, as glasses, a device that lets you interface neurotechnologically with the brain and the outside world. This is what's known as a brain-computer interface. This new technology also can be hardware, as I'm telling you, could be a device, a physical device, or it has a software component to it, and we're talking about AI. So both things are merged in the current neurotechnology and in the future neurotechnology. So neurotechnology is now very important because since 2013, when President Obama launched the BRAIN Initiative, the US and many countries after that have jumped in on a race to build better neurotechnology. Why? For these three reasons that I'm telling you: for scientific reasons, for medical reasons, and particularly for economic reasons. So in fact, since a couple of years ago, and I'm going to share my screen now. Let me just show you a couple of slides. So we have not just BRAIN initiative in the US, but there's an international BRAIN initiative. There are BRAIN initiatives in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, in Europe, in Canada, in Israel. And they've all been now put together in a global BRAIN initiative since 2017. So we're talking not about just a country pushing this, the whole world, all the industrialized nations are betting that new technology is going to be very important. And then to top it off, since last year, the private sector has overtaken public investment in neurotechnology, at least in the US, by a lot. It's estimated that federal funding into neurotechnology was about $560 million this last year, and the private sector invested about $3 billion, so 6 times more. So we're talking about a global race for neurotechnology, no? that will essentially revolutionize neuroscience and enable the methods to get to these issues of understanding how the brain works. No? So how potent is new technology? Let me just show you a couple of examples. One of them is from our own group. So we work with mice, and we train mice to lick every time they see these vertical bars of light. And when we show the mouse a horizontal bar of light, we train the animal not to lick. So that every time the mouse sees one stimulus, one visual stimulus or another, he licks or doesn't lick, and he tells us what he saw. Simultaneously, we use neurotechnology to read the activity, in this case using optical microscopy to photomicroscopy and calcium imaging to read the activity of the parts of the brain in the visual part of the brain of the cortex that are involved in decoding this visual information. And we use also technology to activate these neurons in particular ways. So in this experiment, we can both read and write activity into the brain of the mouse. So what we do is the following. As I show you, first we show him a vertical bar, a bunch of neurons light up, number 1 here, and the animal licks. Then we show the mouse horizontal bar, a different set of neurons get activated and the animal doesn't lick. And then comes the interesting experiment. We turn off in particular ways. And when we activate the neurons labeled in 1, which were the neurons that were activated when the animal saw the vertical stimulus, the animal licks. In other words, we're taking over control of the behavior of the animal by activating selectively a set of neurons in the brains. This is an example of how neurotechnology can be used to decode and manipulate brain activity, and in doing so, decode perception and manipulate perception so that we can manipulate the behavior of the mouse as if it were a puppet. And what can be done in mice today could be done in humans in the future. Let's talk about the human case. By the way, these issues that neurotechnology can decode and be used to potentially manipulate the human mind, it's been pointed out by magazines and newspapers. The bottom here is Science News. This is just last week's issue on mind decoding. And let me just show you an example of my colleague, Jack Allan, who will speak later in the symposium, who uses fMRI to scan the brains of human volunteers and map the activity of their cortex in response to a visual stimulus. And when he does that, every type of stimulus generates a different type of visual activity map. So then Galan and his group can ask the person, okay, now think of one image, and using these maps, they can triangulate what the person is thinking about. So this is the early days of brain decoding, as you will hear more about this from him. These are technologies that are in the hospitals right now, but there is now a similar technology that is available commercially. This is a portable scanner of brain activity that the company Kernel is starting to sell, where you can do these types of brain maps of activity. This is low resolution compared to the fMRI maps that I just showed you. But still, it's important because this type of neurotechnology is regulated as if it were a consumer electronics device. These are technologies to read. How about technologies to write into humans? So I told you about brain-computer interfaces. This is an example of a woman. This is the work of John Donoghue at Brown, in which she has electrodes implanted into her motor cortex, and by thinking, using these brain-computer interfaces, she can move this robotic arm with her thought. And she can drink from this cup by her own volition for the first time in 20 years. She's a paralyzed person. This is pre-brain initiative neurotechnology. I can show you an example of a more sophisticated neurotechnology. This is now a chip getting built here at Columbia, which is flexible. It's implantable. It has 1 million electrodes and is wireless. And the idea is to use this invasive neurotechnology as a prosthesis for blind people. You can implant them in the visual cortex and connect this device to a camera, and that way you may be able to help blind people, help them see by implanting, just like we did in the mice, images of the outside world directly into their brains. because of the possibilities that neurotechnologies can be used to decode and manipulate the human thought process, a group of us that includes many of the speakers, including Joe Fins, met 2017 and proposed a new neural rights, which is a human right solution to the potential ethical and societal issues of neurotechnologies. Similar set of new human rights were proposed by Aenca and Adorno, and Marcello Aenca will also speak at this symposium. So I just finished by saying, what are these new neural rights? So these are rights that protect the mental privacy, so that the contents of the mind cannot be extracted and decoded without our permission. The right to protect our own identity. The identity ourself is actually generated by our brain. It doesn't come out of thin air. It's a result of this brain activity. And because neurotechnology can manipulate this brain activity, can potentially manipulate this identity. We also propose the protection of agency, our free will, our liberty, our cognitive liberty, should be something that should be a basic human right. And finally, we propose the neural rights, the fair access to cognitive augmentation, because these neurotechnologies can be used to enhance human cognition. And this should be judged and under the universal principle of justice. This should not be a matter of who has more money to have access to these technologies, but because it will otherwise create a society with two types of humans, ones that have been augmented and ones that are not augmented. Final neural rights is the protection from bias and discrimination. This has to do with the AI, with the softwares that are used in neurotechnology. And as you know, Chile is pioneering this approach in the constitutional amendment and the neural rights bill that are now undergoing discussion in the Chilean Senate. I'm not going to go into this, but I did want to finish by telling you that besides Chile, there are other efforts in other parts of the country. And in fact, I'm proud to announce that we're creating a network, which is called a Neural Rights Network. It's a grassroots network. And we have people, 38 members from all continents except Antarctica in different countries. And our charter is to promote the advocacy and education with respect to these neural rights. And those of you who are listening and want to contribute with your work and your time to this cause, you're welcome to contact us and join this neural rights network. And with that, I will finish. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And now we are going to hear Pedro Maldonado. Pedro, the screen is yours, and remind you to turn on your mic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. It's an honor to participate in this symposium. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I will share. And I hope that you will all see it. Can you confirm that now? Francisco, can you tell me whether you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, it is working perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So I thought that I can contribute telling about risk assessment of neural right violations. Neural rights cannot be overstated, but amidst the discussion on the new laws about neural rights in Chile, there were questions about how serious was to write legislation about behaviors that are not occurring yet. So legislation should be about behaviors that can happen, not about behaviors that are not happening yet. So I think that legislation and public policy about neural rights must consider the actual probability of these rights of being violated. And our responsibility as a scientist relate to the fact that we can contribute to the debate, but estimating the current and future threats to these neural rights. Now, in this symposium, we'll be talking about a lot of different neural rights, which you can see here in the screen. And the question is that what is the probability that in the currently or in the near future, these neural rights will be violated? Let's start with the easier one. Bias and discrimination. There's no doubt, and I think that there's agreement among the people that at least artificial intelligence algorithms currently now have a lot of biases. And the reason for that is that this algorithm optimize what they are taught. And we know that the data that they use to train this algorithm comes from human behavior, and human behavior is completely filled with biases. So it is very clear that this is a very real and current threat that need to be dealt with. Would like to note that the neural rights laws that have been proposed and written so far in Chile do not include this item. AI algorithms are not part of the current laws, so they may be considered in the development of what is being worked today as a national artificial intelligence policy. And I hope this will be implemented because this is really the most real of the threats. There's other rights that relates to what Rafael very nicely described as what makes us human, right? Autonomy, agency, our mental integrity, and psychological continuity. However, we really don't know exactly how these behaviors comes about. As Rafael pointed out, our brain is a very complicated system. And we used to think that many of our behaviors relate to the activity of a particular area of our brain. That is a site for agency, a site for solidarity, or a site for memories and so on. But now we know that the brain is a very complex network where many of these behavior and features of us as humans are distributed over a large network. And so it's not easy to identify a particular location that relates to one of these behavior. And that makes us a problem because if we intervene or explore or read or write into a particular location, will be not enough in order to modify or violate this right. So we still have to learn a lot about this behavior in order to intervene this situation. In addition, we know that from clinical study that this is something real. I mean, clinical intervention can result in the change of identity and free will, but we don't know exactly why this is so. So although this threat and risk is real, I would say the intervention are still very unpredictable at an individual level. And talking about the current legislation, it's also worth noting that the Chilean legislation exclude the medical intervention because they are performed in a clinical settings, and this is a part of a completely different type of legislation. So the current legislation relates to neuron technology that are separate from those involved in medical world. What it's interesting, and it's this new right about mental privacy, because what the people normally hear about neural rights and they're afraid of is whether we can, at this point, read people's mind. And most people, when faced about this question, this is what they're concerned about. Can we read their mind? What does it mean, read their mind? Doesn't mean that somebody can tell whether I like my boss or whether I will vote for a particular candidate on the next election. Is that what we can really do? I mean, certainly not. And we need to be very accurate and precise about this, because our responsibility as scientists is to provide with very precise information so people can make decisions. As Rafael pointed out, we have been recording neural activity for decades, and we can do so now that we can even help people use the mind to move robots and so on. But can we tell what a person is thinking? And can we do that without their consent? We are trying, but we're not there yet. A few examples of this is a work by Adam Just in which they use fMRI scans to record the activity of people while they reading propositional. And they were actually building a model in which they can very, very well predict what particular activity will be related to a particular sentence. And they did that with very high percentage. And as Rafael also mentioned, there's this wonderful work by Jack Elan, who will be talking later on, in which he trained an algorithm which can, using fMRI scans, predict very well what people were seeing in a particular movie. However, it's very important to point out that these wonderful discoveries results only when they have the full cooperation from the subjects. And so if the subjects do not cooperate, really, nobody can read our minds so far. And also, these algorithms are very special and work with one particular person and cannot be generalized to everybody. So, because they need to be trained with particular set of data. We can do the same question, right, about whether we can also write our minds. And as what happened with reading, we have been doing this also for a long time. In our lab, for instance, we've been able to write activity in the brain of rats and make them discriminate between different visual stimuli without this ever existed. So we can actually create particular perceptions in animals without this being real. However, a key question is that how far are these advances in which we can really read and write minds? And a key challenge, which I think we need to really stress, relates to the fact that our brains, different brains of different people, are not the same. And the finer we look into the behavior, I mean, we also have activity, emotional activity involving the same areas. But the emotion about a birthday party or about a partner will have a particular features that not be the same exactly in two different people. Different brains can be different even in a large structure like this folding. And the finer you look into the structure of the brain, the more different brains are. So in order to read and write a particular brain, we will need to understand a lot about that particular brain before able to do it. We can do coarse things for general brains, but we cannot go finer and finer in an exponential way with the same advantages. So we face a challenge here that may be protections for threats about reading or writing our mind. So overall, I think that the conclusion of this presentation will be that we as scientists are responsible to provide accurate information. And I think that risk assessment will help us to understand what the ethical priorities are in order to establish new neuro rights. And thank you very much. I will stop sharing my presentation now.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And now it's time for Abel Wajnerman Paz's presentation. Abel, the screen is yours now.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I'm going to share my slides. So, okay. Well, The area that has addressed several of the central problems and concepts related to neural rights is neuroethics. It has been often emphasized that neuroethics is not merely applied ethics, but fundamentally involves critical application and philosophical elaboration of neuroscientific concepts to deepen and update our understanding of key ethical concepts such as consciousness, autonomy, agency, identity, and so on. The development of neural rights is a special case of this process of conceptual updating. In this case, the motivation for conceptual change is not neuroscientific research per se, but rather neurotechnological risks. Neural rights extend fundamental ethical and legal concepts in order to include aspects of human life that had not previously been considered and that new technologies could endanger. Being focused specifically on risk, there are two fundamental questions regarding the nature of neural rights which can have an impact on how they are developed. The first one is what counts as neurotechnological risk, and the second one is what or who is at risk. Looking forward into the future of neural rights, I would like to share two ideas regarding how philosophy and neuroscience could work together to offer an efficient approach to these two questions. Philosophers are trained in discovering possibilities not actually available or easily foreseeable, but nonetheless nested in the concepts, frameworks, or models that are currently being theoretically or experimentally developed. This ability may be relevant for thinking about the possibilities nested in neurotechnologies and the impact they can have on key neural rights, such as mental privacy and psychological integrity. The main idea behind mental privacy is to protect the mind from the unprecedented access to neural processing provided by emerging new technology. Philosophers have raised ethical concerns regarding conceptual possibilities entailed by technological mind reading, such as should the digital copy of a subject's experience be ethically treated as part of her mind, or should the output of technological mind reading in forensic context be legally treated as testimony or just as health information, and so on. However, it has been pointed out that many of the current technological applications still have significant limitations in their ability to read minds, and therefore they are not yet a threat to mental privacy in the sense that the mentioned questions suggest. For example, several of the studies that allow us to distinguish the content of thoughts, whether we are thinking about a house or a boat, have a multiple choice design in which both the person and the algorithm decoding her brain state can only choose from predetermined options. That is, we plausibly do not have yet a limited real-time access to the mind of a person, as Pedro just said. However, as McCarthy and Haselager have pointed out, the refusal to legislate on mental privacy on the basis of technological limitations is arguably an instance of the so-called delay fallacy in reasoning about risk. For the case of mental privacy, the idea would be that since robust mind reading that would put mental privacy at risk is not yet possible, and therefore we don't know what characteristics it will have, we should wait for that technology to be fully developed before deciding how to regulate it. The problem with this line of reasoning is that by the time the technology is already fully developed and massively embedded in society, the technical characteristics and social practices associated with it may become too entrenched to be easily modified, which is currently the case with many computer technologies. This idea is also related to the Coleridge dilemma. Therefore, thinking beyond actual possibilities is a sensible part of assessing new technological risk, for which, as I said, philosophical conceptual exploration could be useful. Now, it is also true that excessive expectations or unwarranted concerns should be avoided when reasoning about the potential impact of a technology that is not yet fully developed. This is why reflection on future technological possibilities must be heavily constrained by neuroscience. So what does current neuroscience suggest about the future of mind reading? There are reasons to believe that the relatively full-blown technological mind reading is a not so far-fetched possibility. There are approaches that, as Rafael said, are already overcoming the limitations of multiple choice studies. For example, recently developed the coding methods define a semantic space in the cerebral cortex that represents thousands of different categories as a result of the many possible combinations of neural activity patterns recorded by fMRI. The work of Jacques Galland's team is a fine example of such approaches. Another important line of research is that carried out by Rafael's own team that has achieved unprecedented access and understanding of neural code through the visualization and manipulation of multicellular units known as neuronal assemblies. So a full understanding of mental processing at this fundamental level can potentially enable a virtually unlimited technological reading of the mind. Thus, I think that as long as philosophical conceptual exploration is grounded on neuroscientific research programs of this kind, it could be useful for assessing what the potential risks of neurotechnology are. And also, philosophy could help to understand how neurotechnology developments may not only introduce new risks, but also change that which is at risk. In particular, from situated approaches to cognition, which, because of the relation with Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana, have had a strong presence in Chile, it has been argued that some neurotechnological devices could form a constitutive part of persons. For example, it was argued that brain-computer interfaces that restore the communication capabilities of patients with locked-in syndrome are part of the minds of those patients. This extended mind hypothesis posits that when an external device is sufficiently integrated with a person's brain mechanisms, they can become part of who that person is. And as neurotechnology becomes more and more integrated with the human mind, the boundaries between mind and machine could be minimized. A prime example perhaps being current adaptive neurotechnologies, such as closed-loop deep brain stimulation. What would this mean at a legal and ethical level? The ethical implications of mind extension have been captured by the so-called ethical parity argument. The main idea is that if an artificial device, say a neural implant, is ontologically equivalent to a part of a person's brain, then it has to be ethically and legally treated as such. This implies, for instance, that if non-consensual alterations of her brain by an external agent are considered violations of her psychological integrity, then the same applies to alterations of the device itself. Thus, the current and future development of new technology could have an impact not only on what the risks are, but also on what is at risk, who we are protecting. And being aware of these transformations requires, again, the collaboration of neuroscientific research and philosophical analysis. I think that some important aspects of the Chilean bills constitute a first step in the development of neural rights by exploring these two central issues. That is, what counts as neurotechnological risk and what is at risk. This kind of deep philosophical and neuroscientific evaluation and transformation of ethical and legal concepts requires the interactive collaboration of neuroscience, humanities, law, and the general public, for which I think that more instances of conversation like this are needed. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, Abel, for your presentation. And finally, we welcome Joseph. He's gonna talk right now. Joseph, the screen is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here in New York, but virtually with all of you in Chile. I wish we could be all together, but this is the neurotechnology that gets us there. I'm going to share my screen, and can you all see it, please? Yeah. All right. So what I want to do is talk about neuro rights, capabilities, and covert consciousness as a example of how we think about these things. So first of all, I want to align myself completely with everything that Rafa said at the outset as a member of the Morningside group and endorse this Chilean effort to bring this into the Constitution. But I want to offer a complementary and contrarian argument, also positing positive versus negative rights. And this is to engage people with disorders of conscious, my area of work over the last 25 years. And I heard what Pedro said about the medical exclusion in the constitutional debate in Chile. But I think, sometimes the investigative and clinical exceptions are not always clear and the lines are blurry. And sometimes you have to do investigative work to achieve clinical impact. So I want to talk specifically about the question of covert consciousness or cognitive motor dissociation. These are people who phenotypically at the bedside look like they're unconscious and are in the vegetative state, but are actually covertly conscious. And I'm going to talk about the challenge of actually probing the brain without their consent, and thinking about neural privacy as an end versus a side constraint. I'm going to argue that the greater goal is to identify these people with disabilities, engage them, and that's consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the UN Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities, which is part of what Rafa was saying. This human rights approach is a broader conceptualization. Finally, I'm going to contend that given neurotechnology, which is the focus of most of the brain initiatives, the focus should be on capabilities, not just rights, invoking the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who've written eloquently about capabilities. And I'm going to argue that we need to identify these people with covert conscience to promote their social integration, avoid discrimination, and promote social justice. The definition of neuroethics that Abel was just talking about, historically it's complicated. I've written about this, but most people accept that it started at this conference that the Dana Foundation had in 2002 back in San Francisco. And one of the prominent definitions, which I think has been the genesis of this kind of wary neuroethics concerned about rights and the like, was defined by William Safire, who was the president of the Dana Foundation, a New York Times columnist, a former speechwriter for Richard Nixon. I'll give you that so you can make your own judgment. And his definition was an examination of what is right and wrong, good and bad about the treatment of, perfection of, or unwelcome invasion of, and worrisome manipulation of the human brain. The specifics of brain science hits home as research in no other organ does. So the upshot of this has become sort of the dominant mantra in neuroethics that I think has led to lots of concern. We have this great cartoon from the New Yorker, Pinocchio, going into the scanner. This is pre-brain initiative technology, Rafa. And what we have here is a worrisome neuroethics of neural integrity, risks of cognitive enhancement, words like neural privacy, cognitive liberty, concerns about legal abuses versus clinical uses, fear of therapeutics as manipulation, and a kind of a negative idealization of neuroscience. And I think that while these negative rights are important, okay, it could also leave people behind, and we need to think about it more capaciously about positive rights as well. So what I'm going to talk about really briefly is this category of what my colleague Nico Schiff has called cognitive motor dissociation. Adrian Owen first illustrated this in the Science paper, where a patient who was overtly vegetative was asked to play tennis in her head, to walk around her house and disaggregate linguistically similar words. And she, through this volitional effort, was able to do this, betraying her overt bedside examination and putting her into the minimally conscious state. I've written about this in the most recent issue, edition of Stupor and Coma. So what happens here is, okay, to look for cognitive motor dissociation, you need to invade a patient's neurological space without their permission. Is that a straw man argument? Perhaps, but again, if you go back to the Sapphire definition, legitimate therapy or diagnostics presumed as unwelcome invasions, seemingly done by force without consent. Those are his words. And again, this taken to an extreme could be abusive. And a violation of privacy and neurocognitive liberty. But the paradox is we can't know if a person could conceivably give permission or consent until we know they have CMD and it's identified. We then therefore need to interrogate the brain conceivably over their unspoken objection of the individual. But is this a problem? First, as Abel just talked about, identifying CMD is not necessarily knowing somebody's thoughts. It's really evidentiary of a potential to perhaps have or generate thoughts. And it's a function of discovery of potentiality rather than actual content. Okay, so I think that's an important distinction. identifying potentiality versus thoughts. Now, the message is clear. If you do this, you're engaging in a dangerous kind of exceptionalism. This is Maggie Worthen, who I profiled in my book, Rights Come to Mind. She was thought to be in the vegetative state. We found her to be in the minimally conscious state or above, and with an eye tracking device, eventually was able to communicate at 90% accuracy. To say we couldn't investigate her brain without her permission deprives her of the therapeutic possibility and compounds marginalization of an already vulnerable population that has been historically neglected. Communication is critical. And if for our Spanish speaking audience, everybody knows this was mistranslated. The Almodovar film Talk to Her. In Spanish was hable con ella, right? The key word is con. It's the reciprocity. The only consciousness that I know is my own. The only way I project my consciousness, even over Zoom, is through communication. So with the functional restoration of communication, we restore community, which is a very important point. Now, this is a study that was done by Monty in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2010, taking the Owen paradigm, toggling this to a yes-no communication. We previously used deep brain stimulation to get someone who was the minimally conscious state and non-communicative to be able to communicate. So the technology reveals and responds to the problem of covert consciousness. And again, this gets to the notion of capabilities. Disability rights and consciousness. This is I've argued that brain injury in the New York Times and in my book is a civil right we don't think about, and communication builds its cognate community, social integration, and lets these people speak for themselves. I think this trumps speculative concerns about neural privacy. At Yale Law School, where I also teach, we have been arguing and advancing the rights of people with severe brain injury. And I think as Chile begins to think about their rights language, I think it has to also think about the rights of people with disability and make sure that the focus on the negative rights doesn't impinge excessively on the positive rights and the needs of a marginalized, historically vulnerable population. And I would just begin to conclude here by invoking Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who've written eloquently on the capabilities approach. And I think we need to go from rights to capabilities. If we give people rights, but we don't give them the technology to exercise or realize those rights, we've deprived them. And I think we have to focus on the instrumentality of neuroscience to restore communication and community that could be impeded by neuroexceptionalism, and it's essential to embrace positive obligations even as we protect the negative rights. This is an old slide, but it's one of my favorites. And in Spain, they have a Dia del Daño Cerebral, and they have this saying, una vida salvada merece ser vivida. A life that is saved deserves to be lived. So let's not let our honest and legitimate concern about protecting civil liberties and neuro rights in any way impinge upon the needs of this vulnerable population. Align yourselves with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, discapacidades, and make this more than a negative statement, but also a positive articulation of need. I want to just thank my funders and the families who've consented to participate in our studies, and a picture of New York City. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation. And now we have only a few minutes, let's say 5 minutes for questions or debate within the panel. So any questions?
Actually, if I can say something, in terms of the balance between positive and negative liberties that Joe was mentioning, I also wanted to make clear that the Chilean bill of law for neuroprotection describes and protects the use of neurotechnology for medical cases. So those are considered kosher. In fact, what it does is it brings the non-medical use of neurotechnology into medicine. So applies to the non-invasive BCIs, the existing Chilean medical code, which means that decisions, so we're not really talking about how patients will use this new technology. They will continue to profit from this new technology, but the Chilean law essentially applies to non-invasive, non-patient use, the same rigor and the same legislation that that it applies to invasive and medical uses. So sort of bringing it all under the umbrella of medicine. Yeah.
Thank you, Rafael. Any comments, questions?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would like to stress what Joe said, because legislation that was intended to protect patients, for instance, resulted in the loss of many medical scientific projects here in Chile. Just even one example, in our lab, we were doing EEG recording this patient with minimal consciousness. Because they could not give their consent, they would no longer be studied. And exactly as you said, by the good intention of the law, a few patients were actually excluded from potential beneficial studies. So it is a problem.
Abel?
No, just a brief comment about what has been said. I think that perhaps that has to do with something that can be added to the Chilean bills about the exceptions regarding there is also nothing said about, for instance, the exceptions to mental privacy violations, which have been considered in the literature, for instance, due to national security reasons or something like that. And also in this case, I agree that psychological integrity in those cases must have some exceptions, especially related to cases just as those mentioned by Joe.
Thank you very much. Any final comments?
I also wanted to touch on this issue of whether is it time for protection? Is it too early? There's two types of new technology to read or to write. And reading is always ahead of writing. And this is not just new technology. As you remember from your grammar school days, it's much easier to read than to write if you learn a new language too. No? The same thing with new technology. So I think just roughly, I would say, reading new technology is 5 years ahead of writing. So in terms of decoding the brain activity of mice, so we've been able to do this for a while, but to manipulate it in specific ways, it's just something very recent. No? But I mean, we're going to have a whole session devoted to mental privacy, but my impression is that potential abuses of mental privacy using neurotechnology are around the corner. And why do I say that? Because it's already some primitive way of decoding can be done with fMRIs, as we're going to hear about that a lot in the talk. But these portable scanners are now enabling that to be done at home in a way in which the data is actually interpreted, sent out to the server, interpreted by some algorithm somewhere, and with respect that this decoding is individual specific. That's not a problem for companies interested in decoding, because they already have a model of each of us. So so it's going to be a individual model of each person and the brain activity of that person, and that model is going to get decoded somewhere else. And so that, I think it's around the corner. I think this is something that we should be worried about. And with respect to protection from writing technology, so I completely agree that it's not around the corner. But again, we want to prevent the Collins-Rich problem. No, we want to. We know it's coming. I'm showing you how we can do it in mice. This is coming our way. Sooner or later, this will be possible in humans. So there's no reason to doubt that. So why wait? I think it's a perfect time now that technology hasn't been developed to put the guardrails so that it gets developed in the right fashion.
I think there's a historical analogy, Rafa, looking at asilomar and recombinant DNA and allowing it in non-germline cells and not seeing it being passed on generationally. So I would say, reading versus writing is kind of another kind of bright line distinction. And we still haven't endorsed germline recombinant DNA, and it's been, you know, mid 70s when we had Asilomar. So I think it's important to anticipate it and distinguish you know, the distinctions between these two functionalities.
Well, if I may add a short comment.
Okay, a short comment, yes.
I think that it's very clear from our conversation that the neuroscientists and other scientists, along with the medical community, need to really get in touch and talk to the political world and the decision-making group, because these worlds have been classically very much separated. And what is being exemplified here is a very clear case of the need to getting close if we're going to write laws that actually make sense to the public.
Thank you. Well, I think you are already reading my mind. It's time to stop and to thank Rafael, Pedro, Abel, and Joseph for this insightful conversation on the present and future of neuro rights. Thank you very much. And after a short break, we will come back with session A on autonomy and agency. Thank you all. Welcome to session A on autonomy and agency. In this session, we will be discussing issues related to the right to free will. That is, the idea that individuals should have ultimate control over their own decision-making and actions without unknown manipulation from external neurotechnologies. We will hear comments from Sara Goering and Haselager. Let me introduce them. Sara Goering is a professor of the Ethics and Disability Studies program at the University of Washington. She's an adjunct in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities. She co-chairs the ethics group at the Center of Neurotechnology at the University of Washington. She teaches courses in bioethics, ethics, disability philosophy, feminist philosophy, and medical philosophy. Her research is focused on studying the effects of neural technology on personal identity, agency, and autonomy, as well as helping to create better informed ethical guidelines and education for neuroscientists and neural engineers. Haselager is an associate professor at the Department of Artificial Intelligence and the Donders Institute for the Brain, Cognition and Behavior at Radboud University in Nijmegen, Netherlands. He has a PhD from the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, Netherlands, and he specializes in the ethical and social implications of research on brain-computer interfacing and brain stimulation. Now, we are going to hear Sara Goering. Hi, Sara, the screen is yours, and remember to turn on your microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I will start sharing my screen now. Is that accessible?
Yes, it's working perfectly.
Excellent, thank you. Oops. So I thought I would just start with a quick philosophical view on agency and autonomy, what they are. So I think of agency as something that's primarily about initiating action. The paradigmatic case of agency for human agency is acting intentionally. It's about doing something rather than just being acted upon. And part of that is really having this feeling that we're authors in our lives, right? That our actions flow from our beliefs and intentions. But I think it's important to recognize that agency isn't just purely this. So we can act agentially in ways where we don't have a conscious initiation of action. So for instance, habitual actions that we've developed over time are still part of our agency. They're things that we do, even if we're not consciously thinking of doing them, we do them rather out of habit. Also, I don't think they need to be fully intentional. So you think about the ways that implicit bias can be part of the way that we view the world and can influence the actions that we have, even if we're not consciously or fully intentionally aware of how they're influencing us. And then I also think that we want to recognize that agency doesn't need to be free from, somehow isolated from outside influences, that we're often nudged by things around us or, informed by other people around us. There's a difference though between this sort of low level influence of nudging versus something that is really coercive, which would be an undermining of agency. And because of the interest I have in feminist philosophy, I would also say that we understand agency in a relational way. So a self is constituted in and through relationships with others. As I quote here from Llewellyn and Downey, it's in and through rather than by, intended to reflect the presence of an individual self with agency who's able to reflect and choose, but who cannot do so alone, right? So we're already relational individuals. And then on the autonomy side, I see this as a thing that's one level above agency. So it's a kind of agency, a higher level phenomenon. It involves acting in accordance with one's endorsed values, desires, or commitments. It can be constrained by external oppression. It admits of degrees. In a lot of the feminist literature, it's connected to certain kinds of competencies about self-reflection or self-discovery or imaginative abilities. And I think this too is also understood as a relational phenomenon, right? We develop these skills and exercise them in relationship to other people around us. So why think about these two phenomena in relation to neurotechnology? because these devices, whether we're talking about something like a deep brain stimulator or a brain-computer interface or others, they function within parts of ourselves that seem very central to our being agents with particular identities. Our brains are not all of our identities, right? The embodiment that we have matters significantly, but our brains serve as a kind of control center for our identities and for the initiation of action. When neural devices function well, I do believe, I'm a proponent of these devices. They can restore an individual's sense of agency and identity when they operate well. And you saw this earlier with Rafa's videos that he showed of, people doing things with thoughts, moving the robotic arm to them, moving it out to touch somebody in their life with the picture of Tim Hems here. So it can work very well. It can enable agency. But if they function poorly, or sometimes even if they function as intended for the main target, so for instance, a deep brain stimulator getting rid of Parkinsonian tremor, they may make us question our responsibility for action and change our understandings of who we are. So Pim, who will go next, has a paper called "Did My Implant Make Me Do That?" Right? There's this questioning concern about whether or not I am the responsible party, so whether or not I'm fully agential in that activity. And again, I think neural devices can highlight this kind of relationality of our agency. So some evidence that the neural device can be a modulator of agency, just sort of conceptual evidence here. Jens Clausen says, given that the motor activity is controlled through electrical signals generated by these algorithms, it can sometimes be difficult to decide who the real agent is. Or Lipsman and Glennon say that the device introduces a third party that comes between the person's brain and mind, right? So that can make the implanted device may threaten his conviction that he can control how he thinks and acts. And then finally, Francois Baylis talks about neural devices not being a concern so much for identity, given the ways that identities are dynamic, but that they can be a threat to agency, the ability to make informed and rational choices, as she says, when a person's actions do not flow from her intentions or beliefs, but rather are the result of direct brain manipulation. So these make new ways to directly alter the brain to create opportunities for improving agency, but also can confuse, affect, or manipulate it. Now what I want to do is share with you some empirical evidence from interviews that our group has done and other groups have done about people using such devices expressing some of these agential concerns. So on this first slide, some quotes from people who we've done interviews with who are using a deep brain stimulator, from a group using them for psychiatric disabilities, including depression and OCD. Somebody says, yeah, there are just parts of this where you wonder how much is you anymore. How much of it is my thought pattern? How would I deal with this if I didn't have the stimulation system? You kind of feel artificial. Somebody else says, your feelings don't get attributed to you. They're all due to the device. And a different person again says, I've begun to wonder what's me and what's the depression and what's the stimulator. He was describing doing something that he felt was sort of out of character for him, but he wasn't sure why he had done it. And he was confused about whether or not he was fully responsible for that. From Sonika Dehaan's group, interviewing people who have OCD and are using the devices, somebody says, no, that clearly didn't fit with who I am. It was really too much. It wasn't me, you know. Or similarly, from DBS studies with Parkinson's patients, Schuckbach, this is a paper that gets cited often. I don't feel like myself anymore, or I feel like a robot. And then from a very recent study that our group did, one man said, my wife and I were walking. I was unsteady on my feet. I held onto my wife's hand. All the while I'm trying to figure out where to put my feet. And I'm also trying to figure out what is causing this. He says, yeah, I thought, is it the DBS? It must be. It can't be, right? There's a kind of confusion or just ambiguity about the effect of the device on the person's agency. Or a different person who says, listen, doc, I need you to know, I need you to, adjust me again or whatever. The DBS, he says, is more in control of me now. If we look instead at brain-computer interface study. So this is where we have a device that's recording from the brain in order to try to drive some external effector like a wheelchair or a cursor on a screen or the robotic arm that we saw before. When there's success, so what the person aims to be doing and the external robotic arm does that, it feels agential. The person says, I did that. But when there's a failure, a clear failure, often the person doesn't take responsibility for that. It's errors occurred rather than I made a mistake, right? It's an interesting shift in who's responsible. And I think a much bigger category is where this kind of agential responsibility is uncertain. So people from this Kurgel et al. Study in 2020 say things like, I guess I didn't concentrate hard enough, but it also may be that the measuring isn't optimal, or did the device fail to recognize my mental imagery? Or sometimes computers are dumb at figuring out what your brains are thinking. There are still so many points of failure that are possible in these systems, right? It's just uncertain really what is causing the inaccuracy of action here. Then on the other side, this is from studies that we've been doing recently, interviewing people using BCI to control a cursor on a screen. Again, when it works really well, it's a fantastic enabler of agency. This man says, when they hooked up the computer to my brain, it was actually rather intuitive. I started to move the cursor right away. Everybody was excited because of the level of control I had. But then sometimes it doesn't work. It's a clear failure. He says here, sometimes the computer's with me, in sync with me, and I don't have to give it a second thought. I just do it. Other times the computer isn't in sync with me, and we have to retrain it in order to get as close to being in sync as possible. And when it's not in sync with me, that's why I feel like I'm struggling. It's frustrating. I just want to move, right? There's this thing that's stopping him from doing the thing that he's aiming to do. But again, we get this kind of uncertainty as a common phenomenon. Is the device not tuned well, he says, once when we were there as he's performing this study, it's pulling down and left. And we were talking to him like, well, where is it pulling down exactly? Because he's doing the movement just with his visual imagery, right? He's just doing it with his thoughts. But somewhere in his brain, there's a feeling of a pull that makes it him not able to do the thing he's aiming to do. And then he elaborates, there's a force that I feel that I'm wrestling against. Sometimes it's not as strong. Other times it's overwhelming to where I can't push against it. In fact, it pushes me. I don't understand why it happened on some occasions and not on others. It's something that they're trying to figure out, right? So these are just they're only, right, it's qualitative research, so the numbers are small, but there aren't that many people using, especially the BCI devices. But this is a way for us to be aware of some of the agential concerns, even with the current kinds of devices that we have on offer. All right, this is my last slide. So thinking about how we deal, or second to last, penultimate slide, thinking about how we deal with these concerns about agency, our group has thought about agency, about mapping agency. And this is the kind of image that we came up with when we're thinking about using a neural device. We might think of agency as having at least these 4 dimensions. So one is about authenticity. Does this, when I'm acting with this thing, does it feel like me, right? And I want to note that in the image in this corner over here, this quadrant, it's not that I'm always just static. I'm reflecting back on who I was and then thinking about who I will become. So I'm a dynamic entity, but I still want that entity to feel like me, myself. Similarly with privacy, which I know there'll be a separate session on, it's thinking about who has access to the intimate information that I have in my head and how I have control over the boundaries there. On the responsibility arm, it's thinking, did I really do that? Can I be held accountable for the thing that follows from this behavior when there's this thing intervening between what would normally just be my brain and my action? And then on the left-hand lower quadrant, also thinking about trust. So when I'm getting sensory feedback from certain kinds of BCIs, there's also a question about whether or not I know that that's really the way things happened, or if I can trust myself to know that it did happen in that way. So if we want to think about designing these devices to maintain agency, I would say the uncertainty about responsibility for action or about being treated as responsible for action is really important here. A person may feel responsible but not be treated that way by others. We heard this sometimes in the interviews. If we want to help ensure that agency, we want to make sure people have local control over the technology, that they could turn it off or ramp it down, that they might have individual modulation available with a self-controller, device controller, that they might have preferences regarding autocorrects for it, or the possibility of a readout of device activity they could see, for instance, on an iPhone or a watch or something else for greater transparency of when the device is working. And that would give them some greater possibility for resistance against that device if it feels like, or other people tell them that it seems like it's controlling them in certain, or leading to behaviors that are not their normal behaviors. So we need to recognize the possibility for improved agency with these devices, but also provide some sort of check on them to preserve agency. And I think one of the ways to do this is to have some sort of background legal protection, like the neuro rights that the various groups are talking about in this event. Those things could really help to try to protect and preserve that agency. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to the collaborators at the Columbia meeting and to my team here at UW. And I will stop sharing screen now.
Thank you very much, Sara, for your presentation. And now it's time to hear Pim Haselager. So Pim, you can turn on your mic and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francisco. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about this, and I was very happy to see the neuroprotection bill, for instance. So I think these bills are really important steps to be more specific, maybe about what the rights actually entail, what neuro right might entail, what the neurotechnology might entail, and where there are possibilities to even deepen our understanding further about what is required given the developments of the technology. So I would like to discuss two points, basically, that I hope can help to think about this in some ways. First of all, I would like to mention a little bit the increased role of AI. When we're talking about neurotechnology, we tend to think, me included, and I guess that's logical to a certain extent, especially about progress in brain scanning or all kinds of neurotechnology going towards wearable helmets and stuff. But of course, an additional crucial component of neurotechnology in relation to brain reading, brain decoding, is the capacity of ever more sophisticated algorithms to pick up correlations between brain states and, let's say, psychological interpretations. And it's been obvious, I guess, since the last 5 or 10 years that the progress in machine learning, think about deep learning neural networks, is really humongous. There's a lot of progress in brain scanning technology and neuroscience too, but the algorithms are currently developing so fast that this might be something that we need to incorporate in our bills of rights, of neuro rights. And so here's my suggestion regarding that point. In Article 3, I think, of the Neuroprotection Bill, it says that the consent should be given freely and informed. And I was wondering, looking at this, what the rate of development in AI might imply for the freely given informed consent. I mean, to what extent can we be informed about the to-be expected progress in machine learning, deep learning algorithms that are being applied to brain data that maybe are collected now or even 5 years ago? I'm a bit concerned that this rapid progress that will continue, it doesn't look like it's slowing down very fast, will be or can be at least applied to brain data that we consented to in the past without realizing what maybe the further results of that data analysis by future algorithms could produce in terms of knowledge about our psychological occurrence states or behavioral dispositions. So I think here that we need maybe what I call expiry dates for informed consent declarations. Simply put, if I say yes on the basis of well-specified information about what kind of brain data I am willing to give access to, there should be a kind of time window attached to that consent in order to avoid progress in machine learning and in algorithmic kind of processing of that information, to be able later on to derive information about my mental states or dispositions that were at the moment of giving the consent were not foreseeable. So I call this expiry dates for consent declarations. There's a further question here that maybe is interesting to briefly mention. Normally, informed consent is also about particular purposes for which the information is obtained and analyzed, right? An important question is here, when does increased sophistication in data analysis, brain data analysis, become better in relation to the same purpose, or starts moving towards different kind of purposes? Here too, I think it's really difficult to foresee what the implications are of the large progress in machine learning that we are expecting. You may remember within artificial intelligence, we have this notion of function creep, that certain data collection methods, certain big databases were once collected for one particular purpose and slowly started moving towards other applications. Well, perhaps we could see a kind of function creep due to increased machine learning sophistication in that field too. So in short, I think a temporal window for consent regarding brain data usage is called for. An expiry date for that kind of consent is something that at least we should be investigating as a further update of the neuro rights package. My second point is more focused on agency itself. Now, normally we look a lot at brain stimulation in relation to agency, like I did in myself. But here I think there's a new development that I find very interesting, which maybe is slightly complicated to explain, but let me try and bear with me while I do so. So in BCIs, brain-computer interfacings, you have the active and the passive distinction. Active BCIs require me to intentionally produce a certain brain activity pattern like mental imagery in order to do something. I try to produce a brain signal that can be picked up by the machine to drive a cursor on the screen, for instance. But you also have the passive BCIs, the passive brain-computer interfacings, and these systems look actually at continuously what you would call naturally non-intentionally occurring brain activities and try to derive relevant information from this. Now, this can be done without me intentionally trying to do something to communicate. In fact, I don't even need to be aware of that system trying to use that information. It can be something that's just happening while I'm wearing my EEG cap and maybe thinking about totally unrelated things. And so these passive BCIs, they can use this brain information in order to get some sort of idea to infer aspects of my cognitive or affective states without me trying to communicate to them. It's sometimes called symbiotic technology in the sense that it really doesn't try to get in the way. It doesn't require conscious effort. It just attaches itself to you and it picks up whatever it finds useful. And one nice illustration that I know from the work of Thorsten Sander and Lars Kroll from Berlin was, for instance, you have a small computer screen and you can decide to go in one direction with your cursor to the right upper corner or the left lower corner. And the machine starts trying to help you. But when the machine does something wrong, there's in your EEG an event-related potential, error-related negativity. After a couple of tries, it actually can start guessing which direction is your preferred one. The machine can do that without you being aware. At certain moments then later, it can actually try to probe you with certain movements in order to see whether its hypothesis is confirmed or rejected. So it gets a better and better model over time while you are just playing the computer game in a sense. And so now here's the question that I have. While tapping into that information that you're not aware of, by looking at various brain signals that provide, let's say, reliable correlations over time developed into a reasonable inference about what your preference is in this case, what exactly are we doing in relation to what we would normally call actions? Here's the thing, you may have heard of Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model, where he says, and this makes perfect sense to me, that all the time our brains are processing a lot of information in parallel. In a way, I am aware my brain is processing information that I'm sitting in a chair. It's not what I'm focusing on, it's not what I'm consciously trying to do now. Now I'm trying to communicate. But all the same, there's all this information being processed about where my legs are, what I'm moving, whether my mouth is dry, etc., etc. By tapping into that parallel, continuous stream of information processing taking place all over the brain, we might at some points, through this technology, eavesdrop, if you like, listen in to certain drafts that are being constructed, but then disregarded because they're not really relevant to the overall behavioral patterns that we're trying to produce. It's like in a bureaucracy or a government, there are many alternative plans being made at the same time. And sometimes a smart journalist comes in and gets just some information. And then suddenly this plan that maybe never was going to be affected becomes a story in its own right. And it becomes thereby more important than it otherwise would have been. I hope that my explanation is reasonably clear. I think with BCIs, specific BCIs, we might on occasion be doing something similar, that we just tap into brain signals that even though normally recorded through brain technology would have gone nowhere, would not have, as Dennett says, left a trace, by the sheer fact of being picked up by the technology, start playing a bigger role in our cognitive agency than they would otherwise have done. And it might therefore in some way being the eavesdropping, the listening in through the BCI that creates the trace. And I'm not quite sure actually what that does to my agency, my action, or how that might interfere with my autonomy or free decision making. Because in a way the technology is showing me, for instance, through feedback on a screen, it is showing me part of what I subconsciously was processing, even though otherwise it would never have been noticed by me. So these two things, the risk of informed free consent becoming outdated very quickly because of the enormous progress in machine learning, especially in this particular case, and brain reading through these passive BCIs, this symbiotic technology as affecting the autonomy of individual decision making. These are two aspects, I think, that future neuro right discussions should focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Pim. Now we have at least 12 minutes for conversation. So I wonder if you have any questions or you want to challenge your views. Someone wants to challenge your views, or perhaps I can start the discussion asking something very general. I might get some feedback from you. I was wondering whether all instances of the application of neurotechnologies that by hypothesis reduce autonomy should be avoided, or perhaps we could think about perhaps a trade-off between autonomy and other values such as beneficence or other values. So I would like to hear from you, what do you think about that?
It's a good question. I think one of the things I would think is really important to attend to is whether or not individuals are autonomously choosing that, right? So we might choose to surrender certain parts of our autonomy in order to gain certain kinds of benefits. But again, I think we want to look not only individually, but at the broader social phenomenon. So if enough people choose it, and then others may be very pressured to do so. And I think we want to be careful about what so we already have limitations on what we can autonomously surrender. You know, we can't give up our whole bodies for science while we're still functioning in them. And, you know, we can't allow somebody else to hurt us in very clear way right there. Sorry, the light is changing. We have laws against this. And so I think we want to be, this is part of what we're trying to carve out, is what are the kinds of protections that we want to preserve as a right for everyone. And then once people have that right, then we think about, well, in what ways can they deal and say, well, I would rather have this so that I can do something that I care about doing or that I value in my own life. And I think that's a way of supporting autonomy, right? But we get there autonomously. We don't allow it to happen, you know, without that kind of consent or decision. Pim, do you want to add?
Thank you.
I totally agree. You know, when I ask for help, I'm relinquishing perhaps part of my autonomy, at least temporarily, but I voluntarily did so. And there's nothing wrong with that unless I do it too often, maybe. Or whether I put my trust in the wrong people. I mean, of course, there's always a risk. But the point precisely is, in the extreme cases, either the uncautiously trusting too much, the over-trust. We have the whole over-reliance debate in artificial intelligence, where decision support systems are being trusted too much, leading to a lot of damage. Take the bias discussion as just one example. That applies to neurotechnology. So yeah, the question is, and what rights should aim for, is at least a minimum of self-determination in this respect. But at the same time, maybe also helping to clarify what are the dangerous regions, the gray areas or the exaggerated areas of over-reliance or under-trust, as the case may be.
Perfect. Do you want to, Pim and Sara, open the debate or have a conversation about some of the issues? Sara, please.
Sure. I have just something to throw out for Pim. I was interested in what you said about consent at the beginning and thinking about temporal windows or an expiry date. I wonder also about the consent given freely and informed, right? The informed part. So when we think about some of the algorithms that will be used or that are learning along the way, right? We haven't talked about the black box of what's exactly happening, where we don't have access or there's no transparency on how the algorithm is working. So I wonder if even at the beginning stage, if you would say there's a good sense in which the person is informed, or I guess this is a question about how well informed.
Yeah, well, the problem with being informed, of course, is always, well, first of all, what do we understand? The practitioners and the appliers of the technology, what do they exactly understand, and who's doing the communication? You know, many of these teams are multidisciplinary, and not everybody that talks to the patients understands all the details equally well. So there's already there a difficulty. But I think the problem for many experts in the field too is to make reliable predictions about where machine learning will stand in another 5 years from now. So in a way, if I consent to having my brain data stored somewhere for a certain period of time, we should maybe, in the light of the fast developments of this algorithmic processing, consider making the time window rather short, because what the information specifies about what can be done with the brain might outdate, with the brain data might outdate pretty quickly. And I don't think we're sensitive enough to this particular application, because we tend to focus more, let's say, on the impressive, but nonetheless not as fast kind of progress in actual brain recordings. We're tending to look at the machinery that does the data collection, the data recording, and the progress there. But we should maybe focus more currently on the speed of development in the processing of the data. So when I accept certain technology from companies about brain recording for do-it-yourself use, with the wearables and stuff like that, then in many cases, what is claimed there, what you give away is unrestricted, temporarily unrestricted use of your brain data. And then we can say, yeah, okay, but the information that gets recorded is not all that sophisticated. So what damage can it do? Well, we don't know, because better analysis technology might actually increase the risks. That's something that at least we need to consider, I would think. Can I ask a question to Sara?
Sure.
Yeah, because I am really totally in agreement with the intersubjective nature of agency and identity. We tend to focus way too much, myself included, on the individual with the equipment. So I was wondering, there's now increasing work on brain-to-brain communication. What do you think of that kind of research in relation to this social constitution of identity and agency? Do you see that as something that should be incorporated in neural rights statements? Are we progressing towards a new form of neural bullying? Or, what do you think of that development?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's something that would need to be incorporated in some way, because even though I would say we're fundamentally social relational creatures, we still have, this private internal mental space, which we share with our closest relational others at will, right? They learn to read us and our behaviors, even if we're not exactly sharing things, but there's still an internal privacy space that I think is really important for our independent agency. So even though we're relational creatures, having some control over who has access to that is a way to maintain what I would call intimacy, right? That I decide on who has, it's not, I often think people say, well, what do you have to hide? It's not about hiding anything terrible that's inside my brain. It's more about only allowing certain people to have access to that. And so I think potentially, if there's brain-to-brain interfacing, someone might want that capacity to let their intimate other have that access, but they would again want to have control over when and in what way. And I myself would be very worried about letting anybody have that kind of access, because I would want to make sure that I could stop that connection and have the control over my internal space.
No, I totally agree. And of course, I mean, I think at the beginning, Professor Jaffe said something about, it's difficult to focus exactly on what is currently possible or in the near future. I mean, some of the interpretations of the technology might be way off in the future, more like science fiction. And this is true. So we shouldn't, take only the extreme cases, but it can be worthwhile sometimes to think about future possibilities. If only because ethical discussions take time too, right? I mean, sometimes a good test case, even though it's currently still imaginary, can be very valuable in trying to find out where the current limits of our protections and rights are. And before they get expanded, then maybe, we need some time for that to develop too.
I think that's right. And that's one of the reasons I also wanted to show the quotes from people who are using the current technology, right? That there can be some confusion or ambiguity around agency and responsibility with what we have. So then we want to go back and forth between what the future technology may bring and the problems that are already there now, while recognizing the real benefits that can be offered as well.
Well, excellent. I want to thank you very much, Sara and Pim, for this insightful conversation. And I want to invite everyone after a short break in 10 minutes time approximately for session B on personal identity, psychological continuity, and mental integrity. So it's been great, and thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Welcome to session B on personal identity, psychological continuity, and mental integrity. In this session, we will be discussing issues related to the right to personal identity and psychological integrity. That is, the idea that there must be a legal boundaries prohibiting the technological disruption of neurocognitive processing in general and of selfhood and the sense of self in particular. We will hear comments from Fabrice Giorgiano and Andrea Lavazza. Fabrice Giorgiano is a professor of bioethics at Medical Humanities and director of the Graduate Bioethics Program at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He has a second appointment as a principal investigator at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel, Switzerland. His research focuses on ethical issues in psychiatry and mental health, and in particular on the use of neurotechnologies in psychiatry. Andrea Lavazza is a senior research fellow at Centro Universitario Internazionale Arezzo, Italy, and adjunct professor of neuroethics at the University of Pavia, Italy. His main area of research is neuroethics. In this field, he has written on human enhancement, cognitive privacy, memory manipulation, and cerebral organoids. His general interests are focused on moral philosophy, free will, and law at the intersection with cognitive sciences. He is working on naturalism and its relations with other kinds of causation and explanation in philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. He has published over 80 papers and 11 books, both as author and editor. So thank you very much for joining us. And now we are going to hear Fabrice Giorgiano. Hi, Fabrice, the screen is yours.
Hi. Thank you, Francisco, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the organizer to including me. I'm going to share my screen right now. Does it work? Oh, I don't hear.
Perfect.
Does it work?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what I'd like to do is to talk in my presentation about personal identity and also talk about identity integrity. My concern are more anthropological than legal. And I see the connection between the legal and the anthropological. But when I talk about identity integrity, is to reconsider what is the anthropological framework that is guiding our reflections. How do we ground these neural rights? And so this is what I like to do. I would like to talk about personal identity and especially psychological continuity, then talk about the disruption and preservation of personal identity, and then briefly make a kind of critical comment on this question of identity integrity. And since I have only between 12 and 15 minutes, I'm not going to be able to elaborate, but my hope is that to start a discussion on this issue. So when we look at neuroscience and neurotechnology, advances in these two domains raise fundamental question about the human condition, about the nature of consciousness and sentience, constructs of self and personal identity, and then the meaning of the information that we collect. So what am I, who am I, and then what is the meaning? How do we interpret the information we collect, our brain data? And so these are, for me, fundamental questions. Can we reduce a human being just to the brain, just to mental states, to neurological activity, or should we have a broader perspective on this question about the human condition and what it means to be a human being? So let me briefly talk about personal identity. So as I said, this is my kind of assumption about personal identity. And the question is really to see how does neuroscientific knowledge challenge our understanding of personal identity, what it means to be a human being, but also try to analyze the impact neurotechnologies have, or the application of neurotechnology have on our understanding of what it means to be human, a sense of self. So, as I said, in my perspective is that there are psychological, mental aspects, and there are biological aspects, and in terms of the way we construct ourselves, both the body and the mind will determine the identity of an individual. And then I got interested in comparing a kind of philosophical approach and an approach from psychiatry. And so John Perry is a philosopher, has this concept of person theory, and the way he conceptualizes personal identity includes the following elements: intentionality, that is, it describes the mental conditions that determine the lived body's location in space and time. Local rationality describes human beings as rational agents. Respect for autonomy, and this is the autonomy is the foundation or the moral foundation for human existence, and this is why the relevance of these neural rights. Identity defines as, you know, the character traits or the personality of an individual, and then a formal notion of self, the ability to form a sense of self. And then I want to compare that to John Sadler. Is a psychiatrist and former colleague of mine when I was in Texas, and he has this conceptualization of personal self, and it includes the various elements: agency, the ability to act in the world as an agent, physically and mentally; identity, the recognition of oneself as different from others; trajectory, a sense of purpose in life; history, temporal dimension that provides a sense of the past, the present, and the future to self; and then perspective, a unique outlook and experience of the surrounding world. And it seems to me that when we look at these two approaches, and there are many, but it seems to me, even from a philosophical and I would say from a scientific standpoint, at least from a psychiatric standpoint, we can bring these two perspectives together. And these two approaches provide a description of an individual with a unique status within the world, a unique relation to the world, a unique history and destiny in the world, and a unique perspective about the world. So this is why when I went back to, if I go back to my introductory comments, I want to locate the self or personal identity within its context and not just reduce a human being just to cognitive dimension or mental dimensions. So it is this uniqueness that need to be protected, the physical integrity and the mental integrity of individuals. So we can make a case that you know, the physical integrity and mental integrity should not be separated for anthropological reasons. And one of them is how human beings experience reality in the world, and how human beings develop a concept of self. But in light, and this is what human rights in general are concerned with. But in light of the ability of neurotechnologies to alter, control, and manipulate the mind, a focus on mental integrity is warranted. So this is why now I'm going to turn to psychological continuity. And again, I'm going to be very brief considering the time that I have to present. So on this account, personal identity is closely related to one's ability to create a coherent and organized whole based on a continuum of life experience events that describes one identity. Personal identity is defined in terms of psychological connections regarding consciousness, the ability to connect past and present event, memory, facts about the past and the present, intentions, desires, and other psychological features such as character traits, etc., etc. So these are the attributes that need to be protected because they form our identity or part of our identity, and hence the importance of mental integrity. So Rafa previously was mentioning the brain is where you know, everything is the focus of our identity. And so this is why I think neuro rights are so relevant in this discussion. So if we look at, you know, mental integrity, it's not mentioned specifically in the right to personal identity, but it is implied. Boundaries must be developed to prohibit technology from disrupting the sense of self. So what we need to do is, in order to protect mental integrity, is to affirm the right to personal identity and set clear boundaries about when disruption is acceptable. And there are different reasons why personal identity can be disrupted. It could be a disease like Alzheimer's disease. It could be a traumatic event. There is a traumatic insult to brain structure. The case of venous gauge, everybody knows about it. Therapeutic interventions like lobotomies or psychopharmacology, modafinil, Ritalin, we know this will change the personality of individuals. And of course, we have neurotechnologies, brain-computer interfaces, and artificial intelligence. So in my own work, and the reason I go back to this idea of what kind of an anthropological framework should guide this discussion, should guide our discussion about neuro rights. And these are a collection of my publications on the question of personal identity. I realized they always go back, at least for my own research, go back to this question: what does it mean to be human? To what extent should we allow the disruption of personal identity? It could be related to deep brain stimulation or TMS. It could be related to the use of fMRI computer interfaces to assess and treat psychopathy. It could be also related to some technologies related to the debate about more bioenhancement in terms of changing the behavior of individuals. It could be related to Alzheimer's disease, artificial intelligence, and then also the kind of human-machine interface. So all this is why I'm really interested in this question of what are the anthropological implications of the application of these technologies, and to what extent as a species we should allow ourselves to have technology disrupt our sense of personal identity as a human species, but also at the individual level. So there are different reasons or factors that can disrupt personal identity. It could be intentional. And this is the whole debate about consumer neurotechnologies. You have companies putting on the market various neurotechnologies that will affect our sense of personal identity. And then there are therapeutic interventions to mitigate pathological signs and symptoms. And these are clinical applications. These become more we could justify transforming or disrupting personal identity if an individual will benefit from these technologies. And then this is where I think most of us are really concerned, is when it's unsolicited and covered interventions by the government, military, or even neurotech companies. Gathering data, using that data without us knowing that brain data is used and could also manipulate us in ways that we're not aware. So it seems to me, as we try to implement these technologies, what is key is to work on various aspects. And the first one is to make sure that there is no deception, there is no manipulation. This is very key to what I heard so far, and many people are concerned about this. And then there's the question of privacy and hacking, and making sure that brain data is protected and that if brain data is collected, people should be transparent about this. And then there's the question of autonomy. We should avoid that neurointervention create a state of dependence, or that these technologies would undermine our own agency. And this is, you can make a case, or at least I'm interested in the question of more bioenhancement, to what extent these technologies should manipulate the behavior of individual, for instance, in the clinical case in relation to psychopath, for instance. And then there's the question of rationality, making sure these technologies are not undermining one's ability to advance and justify one's beliefs or ideas. It could be used, if we could write on the brain, it could be used to impose, quote unquote, a political ideology or a set of moral principles. And then also, I think, and this is where it goes back to this question about anthropology, is this question of human flourishing. I think questions of meaning and purpose are key. Why are we using this technology? Why should we use this technology? What is the end goal in applying these technologies on us? And I think we need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of that. So the right to personal identity aims at preserving and protecting mental integrity. However, I would like to finish with a critical point. And here, in my view, the term mental integrity focuses on the datafied brain, that is detectable neural activity, but omits that the mind likewise requires protection. And here I'm developing this concept, but it seems to me that the mental is more about neural activity, is more about capacity. The mind is more about the content. It's more about the ability to reason about a concept, a notion of the good, the right, the just, or about these ideas. And it seems to me that if we talk about identity integrity, it's really about the protection of our mental capacities and the content of our mind. And I think here I'm going to do an analogy with the work of philosopher Charles Taylor in The Source of the Self. He talks about frameworks. That is, these frameworks provide identity and integrity according to what he calls horizons. That is, a way of understanding life, a way of developing as a moral agent. But I think it's very relevant to our discussion. And then he says, the claim is that living within such strongly qualified horizons is constitutive of human agency, that stepping outside these limits would be tantamount to stepping outside what we would recognize as integral, that is, undamaged human personhood. So I think this is key to, when we talk about human agency and personal identity, I think it goes back to what is constitutive of human agency of a particular individual. Therefore, if these technologies are not supporting, or if they're suppressing these horizons or these frameworks, I think this is where I would set the boundaries. So this idea of identity integrity, it is about the preservation of and restoration of psychological continuity. The alteration of psychological continuity, I would say, it's under certain conditions, especially in the clinical context, and then if individuals want to do it, but they need to really understand what is at stake. And then I would say there are these two elements in terms of acknowledgement of an embodied identity. And then the last one, it's how we construct our sense of self. It's always in relation to others. And so here, I'm wondering to what extent technology can have this ability to relate to us in terms of recognizing, affirming, and valuing our identity. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrice, for your presentation. And now it's time to hear Andrea Lavazza's talk. Please, Andrea, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Good morning. Thanks for this very kind introduction, and many, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this amazing event. Now I'm going to share sorry, my screen. Okay, I hope you can see it properly.
Yes,
and given the short time, I immediately focus on the topic I've been given today, and I'd like to start with a quote. It is taken from a famous work that has become a manifesto of civil resistance. You know, what Thoreau seems to be telling us is that the state or some other entities cannot really violate the sanctuary of our thought, of our conscience. And in this sense, neurotechnologies that were unpredictable in his time seem to be able to break down the last wall, so to say. But as an introduction, I think it's also helpful to stress that if in Thoreau's time, one was not able to read or alter the mind of an individual directly, there were and still are many ways to do it indirectly. I think that forms of persuasion, censorship, control, constraint, even subtle and little perceived by the subjects, are always at work, and we should not forget them in the face of the new and motivated concerns related to neurotechnologies. That said, I'm very sympathetic to the Chilean Senate Bill of Law. Mental integrity is certainly a complex concept, and I think it is in any case a condition and a value to be preserved and protected at the highest level. I will not talk today about personal identity and psychological continuity for reason of time, but these concepts will also be implicitly considered in my talk. I would just like to highlight that personal identity and psychological continuity are equally complex concepts, both from the philosophical perspective and from the viewpoint of their operational and empirical identification and implementation. In any case, as seen in Thoreau's quote, mental integrity means, in a very brief definition, the ability, in my view, obviously, the ability to formulate thoughts, judgments, and intentions, make plans, and start implementing them without direct external interference of any kind. And interference due to specific neurotechnology if our concerns are in particular focused on new devices and instruments, as it is the case today. Given that the seat of all this is our mind-brain, and I will say a word about this dyad shortly, mental integrity, especially in relation to neurotechnology, refers to protection from unwanted external interference in any form and for any period of time. By start implementing, I mean the mental cerebral part of an action, since I can be free, as we know, in my intention, but otherwise physically prevented from doing something. And neurotechnologies mainly regard thoughts and intentions. In this sense, it is a hard task distinguishing the mind from the brain. And I think here it will be enough to say that a complete definition of mental integrity should try to address the conceptual and empirical relationship between mind and brain, at least at the functionalist level. I think we cannot delve into the ontological level, and so we need to stay at this level. But once there is a consensus to introduce the right to mental integrity, it remains to be decided how to concretely protect it. Elsewhere, in a paper of mine, I tried to formulate a more limited technical principle. It was related to prosthesis. And I think this principle now can be extended for our purposes. That's it. The technical principle for the protection of mental integrity is, in my view, obviously, a functional limitation that should be incorporated into any device capable of interfering with mental integrity. And specifically, any neurotechnological device should, A, incorporate system that can find and signal any unauthorized detection and diffusion of brain data and alteration of brain functioning. And B, any neurotechnological device should be able to stop any unauthorized detection and diffusion of brain data and alteration of brain functioning. There are obviously some practical difficulties with this principle. Some, I think, are quite easily overcome, but others not. For example, a regulation implementing the law could establish the technical specification. But in general, this principle should not only concern specific devices, but act as a general technical operating principle shared by all interconnected systems that deal with decoding or intervening in brain activity. A key point is what unauthorized means, and above all, I think, if we want to have a system that automatically blocks interference, or it signals them only, or again, it can be programmed as desired for one of the two functions. As you can see, these functions are very different, and the consequences are different as well. We know that we can have a technical difficulty related to this principle. It might be difficult and expensive to insert the control functionality into each device, obviously. In this sense, a compromise should be found between cost and degree of protection, I think. And this, in turn, implies a complex interaction among regulators and manufacturers. This could also slow down the arrival of new devices on the market, limiting, for example, the opportunities for consumers and the freedom of enterprise of manufacturers. Again, another difficulty I see is related to the principle in one country, so to say. We know that some theorists of the political revolution in the past said that revolution cannot be in one country. And in this sense, we can say that should Chile, after passing the law, also introduce a regulation that includes the technical principle, international producer manufacturers could simply exclude Chile from their exports so as not to have to bear the cost of the new controls functions. However, I think a positive secondary aspect could be the stimulus to the founding of national companies that produce devices compliant with the new rules. But in general, all this seems to suggest the best way to go is that of treaties or declarations at a global level to ensure that all producers or manufacturers follow the new rules and introduce automatic control functions in their product. Of course, I think there will always be an arms race among those who are willing to harness the potential of neurotechnology to steal data or interfere with the mental activity of people, and regulators and manufacturers on the other end. But I think certainly setting specific rules and trying to technically implement them is an important step. Another controversial and relevant issue is that of the consent of the individual to renounce mental integrity. This is a possibility we need to consider. For example, we cannot exclude that there are some forms of interference with mental integrity that can increase the autonomy of the subject. Some speakers have already talked about this possibility. Let's think, for example, of some forms of compulsion, not at a clinical level, so this scenario is not a medical one. These forms of compulsion can be treated with a closed-loop brain implant. We know that there are objective risks with these automatic systems that act directly on the brain. In particular, they can change behavior at inappropriate times without the individual being able to do anything. In that case, the machine takes control. You cannot do anything to stop it. But I think this risk could be run if the result is an improvement in quality of life. The improvement is on average, obviously, but in general, I think in these cases, this risk could be run. And finally, we can consider the so-called post-humanist objection. In this case, we cannot exclude that there are individuals who are not at all interested in protecting their own mental integrity, who on the contrary want to hybridize or merge with digital devices and instruments in different degrees. And this can mean freely sharing our brain data or allowing a machine to make some decisions in relevant domains of their life. So, having considered all this, we can try to address some final questions I think we need to carefully consider. The first one is, how should we deal with these people who want to renounce mental integrity protection, and with these medical cases, namely cases in which a device can enhance our autonomy by interfering with our mental activity. should we just make sure people give their simple informed consent to all of this? Or should we introduce a stricter form of informed consent? Something more robust, something we can rely on in a more confident way. And again, should we allow selling devices without security controls for those who want to have their mind enhanced or modified without limits? Or should the state introduce paternalistic rules in order to protect the citizens from unpredictable damages to their mental integrity? I think these dilemmas are very relevant. Any law, any regulation of neurotechnologies should consider them and should try to answer them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Lavazza.
Now I'm going to stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much. Well, now we have time for discussion, questions, debate. Fabrice, I don't know, perhaps you can address or tell something about what do you think about those interesting and challenging questions that Professor Lavazza raised at the end of his talk, or perhaps you want to ask him something.
So maybe the question, and I agree with the general framework, but my concern is, you know, treaties, declarations, and this is a question that I discussed with colleagues many times. What are the values, the principles that are guiding these treaties, declarations? Of course, we don't want to over-regulate. But even in the post-humanist objection, you know, people wanted to hybridize. What is guiding us? Is it just the market? Is it just allow individuals to do whatever they want? So is this kind of hyper-individualism that we want? Or is it more based on something else? And so this is always the same tension that we see in these discussions. And I was curious if Professor Lavazza had some ideas about what is the moral framework guiding these discussions other than a proceduralist approach.
Thank you for your comments. Well, I agree with you when you stress that we should not do some form of over-regulation of this field. I think that the route is very tight in a way, in the sense that when we forbid something, obviously we are making over-regulation in a way, but if we say that people are not allowed to behave as they prefer or to follow the market, we are also doing some form of paternalism. I trust people in general. I think they are the best judge of their interests, but I am aware that sometimes a good information is important, and we need to provide people with good information, trying to tell them that some behavior are very risky, for example, that they could lose their personal identity or psychological continuity if they try to hybridize with technological devices. As you very well presented, personal identity is a very complex concept, is a very complex fact, I'd say. So it's very difficult trying to regulate all these features of identity and try to foresee all the risks identity can be exposed to. So as I try to tell the audience, I have some ideas of implementing these principles, but I'm aware that every implementation is open to objections and is obviously not an ideal situation. So I think we are talking about these topics, and this is the first relevant step.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for you, Fabrice. When you were presenting, you suggested that we shouldn't consider only the role of the brain, basically, of neurological activity on the central nervous systems when we talk about both psychological continuity and identity, and that we should pay attention, and this is very important in the philosophical tradition, to the idea of embodiment, for example, and to the idea of the content of our mental states and events. So I was wondering, what do you think that about the connection or the role that they might play, relational and extended accounts of the mind, or in some specific cases of the contents of mental states, in this particular discussion of personal identity and psychological integrity? So if we have a radical and activist account, for example, of the mind, or if we have a more moderate relational account of the constituents of mental contents that include external factor as relevant factors, how we can draw a boundary, and how we draw a boundary, basically, if we are not already making a step towards a more traditional account in which the contents and the mind somehow either is identical or supervene or is realized by brain states.
Well, and this is exactly my question, and it's an excellent point, and this is why I think we need to have this kind of philosophical anthropology to think about these questions, because this will define how we're going to use these technologies. And it seems to me that this is a little bit the kind of transhumanist ideal, moving in that direction. So I think we would need to have a conversation about that, whether it is in our best interest to merge. You know, Ray Kurzweil talks about the singularity, merging with machines. Do we want to go that route? But again, are we embracing technology without reflecting on how this will impact us as human beings? And then in terms of, you know, embodiment and content, I'm not opposed to the technology, to the use of, you know, bionic arms and chips implanted in the brain, because in the clinical world, you can do a lot of good things. You know, people with Alzheimer's disease, they're developing a artificial hippocampus, you know, to help people rebuild a sense of self. So in that sense, this is why we need to be wise in terms of what we are developing, the technologies we are developing, and what is the purpose. If it's just personally for human hubris to say, oh, I can do X, Y, and Z because I'm healthy and I want to do it because it's fun. This is where I would draw the line. But to develop these technologies to help patients, to help people with a particular condition, this is where I would say, absolutely, let's develop these technologies. Now, the question is about consumer neurotechnologies. Is consent sufficient? You know, these technologies, these companies, they will do it. They will sell you devices, robots, but you have to consent, and they will mine your brain data. They will mine your data. And the more you give, and for the device to function, you have to feed. So they know what they're doing. And this is where we need to be very careful. And then, of course, if we can write on the mind, on the brain, as Dr. Yuste mentioned, it's not just reading, but also writing, then I think we need to be very concerned about the content. And again, think about what are the implications for us as human beings, individually and collectively. So, but this is a very important question. And this is exactly why I'm raising these questions about anthropological philosophy or philosophical anthropology, because we go at the core of these questions.
Thank you, Fabrice. Professor Lavazza, I don't know if you have any comments on these.
Yeah. I think Fabrice highlighted a very, very relevant point, because he said that we also need to consider the basic research regarding these technologies. And I think maybe we have a bias in this field. We prefer to put some limits to the use of new devices, and we don't like to put limits on research for these devices in the first place. But I think we could try to think at least about a reversal of this bias. Maybe we can try to avoid to have these devices in the first place, and not to try to forbid their use when we have them. So this is a proposal, but okay, we know we need to discuss it. It's not easy, but I think we have this bias.
I totally agree, and it's an excellent point, because yeah, is there other questions that we shouldn't ask? But of course, it goes against the spirit of scientific inquiry and et cetera, et cetera. So it's very difficult to talk to a scientist and say, well, no, don't do it, because, so the question is, because we can do it, should we do it? And I think this is what you're asking. And maybe sometimes we should say, no, we should drop the project because the implications are so, but this is why I think we need to do upstream analysis in terms of philosophical, ethical analysis, and develop these technologies in conjunction with these reflections in terms of the implications. So, but I very much agree with you. Now, it would be interesting to hear if what a scientist would say about this, because it's like saying a philosopher, well, you know, you cannot export that idea because it's too dangerous, whatever. Again, but it might be a good way to shift, because then the applications would be in some ways vetted by the research, and then you don't have to worry about the implication of the application. So yeah, I very much like the idea that you put forward.
Well, I think it's time to stop this exciting dialogue. We have many questions to ask, and we have already a new conceptual framework also to think about these issues. So I want to thank you deeply, Fabrice and Andrea, for your excellent presentations and insightful conversations about personal identity, psychological continuity, and mental integrity. And I want also to thank you, all the audience, for attending the first day of the workshop, Neuro Rights in Chile, the philosophical debate. The workshop's second day will consist in 3 sessions. Session C on bias and discrimination, Session D on mental augmentation and human identity, and finally, Session E on mental privacy. So I hope you have a nice day or night, depending where you are, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco.